Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast. A little bit more of a relaxed pod at the end of a busy few days, weeks, season, months. It's been hectic, but it's been nicely bookended almost by our regular interviews with Stuart Webber. He often comes out at the end of the season and has a bit of a debrief and gives a bit of an insight into what's coming up in the summer months ahead. And I'm sure you'll have seen by now that that's what we were enjoying on Thursday and bringing to you as much of that as we could. So we're going to discuss the key points from Stuart's interviews and start turning attention to how Norwich build for the Premier League. I am Dave Freezer. We come to you as ever on Future Radio 107.8 FM. You can also watch us on the PinkUn YouTube channel if you prefer the pod in video form, joined by Paddy, Davitt and Connor Southwell. The three of us were down at Colney on Thursday to speak to Stuart. And Pad, what did you make of it all, really, to kick off with?
Well, you know, it's not going to be dull. Whatever he's going to say is going to be pretty headline worthy, and he didn't disappoint. So, plenty to get into. Plenty we've already pushed out onto the PinkUn channels. But for me, top takeaway was his future and that of the head coach. I thought that was, and you can see the reaction on social amongst many Norwich fans at his Christmas come early. I think I've seen more than one Norwich fan saying these. Potentially, obviously it's not done and dusted yet, but the indication or the implication is that both are willing to extend their stays beyond their current contracts, which is 2022. And there's many a Norwich fan already suggesting that will be the best business of the summer because they are where we are at this stage. You know, two championship titles, two promotions, the style of football. We don't need to drill down into it. We all know what the pillars are behind, the house that Daniel and Stuart are building. Faith in youth, the infrastructure project at Colney, which continues apace. As you said, Dave, we were down there yesterday. We saw the beginnings of the soccer bot, the £750,000 360-degree circular training aid. That's well in advance now in terms of the structure. The builders are on site, diggers everywhere. So, all of that is basically a result of Daniel Farke and Stuart Webber coming to this club in 2017 and potentially, if they're going to extend their stay beyond this time next summer, that is excellent news. So, yeah, I mean, there was a lot more besides, but for me, that was the headline of another very revealing chat from their sporting director.
Certainly was. And Connor, it's been a busy few days. Of course, hopefully most of you guys listening and watching will have already had a look at our documentary, The Way Back, which I think has already had 11,000 views on YouTube, isn't it? And various other platforms, of course. So that's been a nice element. But the wheel never stops turning, does it? We've, of course, had the Kenny McLean news earlier in the week, which can't be forgotten about. A real cruel blow for a player who was, a massive part of things this season.
Yeah, Mr. Consistent, wasn't he? Probably. Certainly after Christmas, I thought he was really impressive actually, and sort of listening to. Obviously, I covered the Barnsley game from home, didn't I? You guys went to Oakwell, and I was watching from home, and so was following along via iFollow, and had Ben Gibson sort of alongside Chris Gorham on the commentary, and he was singing his praises. Said that he's probably one of the best players that he's ever played with in terms of being able to do it all and having that sort of talent. So. Yeah, a big blow because it's a big thing, isn't it, for a player to go to the European Championships, particularly after the high of this season and what he's achieved with Norwich, and the fact that really it happened in the final game that was pretty meaningless for probably both sides, but it was an innocent tackle, wasn't it? It's just one of those, I think, where he's probably got his leg caught and he's obviously damaged his knee ligaments, which is a shame, but hopefully it doesn't take the gloss off what's been personally and for the team a very good season for Kenny McLean, and yeah, it's just unfortunate, I think, that now he's going to miss the Euros, but yeah, hopefully he's back in time for the start of the Premier League, because I think if he is, then you'd throw him into that starting mix for sure.
Yeah, strange really, isn't it? That when you think Pookie and Skip both getting injuries, Gibson and Rook not that far back, Zimmerman has been struggling as well. And Pad, that seems like that's going to be a big thing for the club, doesn't it? That they really need to try and make sure that they're not mounting up as many injuries as they are. There's only so far you can go with that. I mean, McLean's kind of a prime example, isn't he? Because, that was a powerful tackle. It was, the guy completely took the ball, but just the power of it left McLean hurt. And it's very difficult to guard against that, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Actually, funny enough, independently of us sort of jumping on here, about an hour ago, he's done which is prior to that injury and the injury confirmation, but he did a little bit media up in Scotland, and I just sort of watched that back earlier today. And on that topic, because they were asking him about the injury, if you remember, he got to his knee at Stoke earlier in the season, and he feared that could be a season ender there. He was talking about he was in a lot of pain. The scans didn't look good, but they went and saw a specialist, and thankfully, I think he was back before Christmas, if memory serves me. But he was talking in terms of across the game, the escalation in injuries this season because of the demands on players that essentially they did, as we all know, it's been almost non-stop for a year and a bit, with the skewed nature of the football calendar. And obviously the Championship is a grueling league at the best of times, but concertinaed into an even tighter time frame. And Norwich have obviously experienced that. You know, there was periods there before Christmas where they were down to bare bones. And obviously the injury he's got at Barnsley, you could suggest, isn't so much wear and tear or the workload element. But he did make the point in this interview that towards the end of the season, it has been a struggle, and the games are starting to catch up with them because their body has had so many demands. And of course, on top of that, he's gone away and played games for Scotland and been very important in getting them to the Euros. So the workload on these players shouldn't be underestimated. You know, we see Teemu Pukki now a little bit in doubt about him going off to the Euros with Finland, and Ollie Skipp. You know, he goes back to Tottenham with a similar sort of rehab period to Kenny McLean, Lucas Rupp, Christoph Zimmermann, Ben Gibson. All of these injuries, probably there is an element to a greater or lesser degree about the workload that has been put on these players. And I would concur. It's terrible news for him in terms of the Euros and going off to play in a major finals for his country, but better news in the sense that I think he probably will be fit for the start of the season, because he is. There's no doubt about it. He's an influential figure, almost an indispensable figure now. If you look at Norwich's depleted central midfield options, that essentially it's him and Lucas Rupp as we sit here right now. Clearly that will be addressed. There's no doubt about it. That is the top priority for them. I think they'll like to do one or two in that area. And of course, Stuart Webber, we've got the lineup this morning. They want to get Ollie Skipp back if all the planets align. So in the context of, at the minute, looking fairly depleted, then Kenny McLean's fitness becomes absolutely vital over the summer. No doubt about it.
Yeah, at Oakwell, Pukki seemed to me to be moving quite well. He had a boot on his ankle, but he seemed, he wasn't, he was weight bearing, he didn't have crutches or anything like that. So allied with what the Finland coach has said, that they are quite hopeful that he's going to be okay for the Euros. Hopefully there's not too much stress to worry about there, but obviously, as ever with international action, as a Norwich fan, you're always going to be that little bit nervous about seeing the players play, and will then be worried if Pukki gets a kick to that ankle or something like that. But that's football. Yeah, injuries are part of football. You have to deal with it. I feel like maybe we all haven't quite appreciated the fact that next season is going to be so different, isn't it? We've just been through an unprecedented, hectic schedule off the back of a very minimal break between seasons. It's been a treadmill, hasn't it? And next season, quite regularly there are going to be 7, 8, 9 day gaps between games. The Premier League is a very different feel to the Championship, isn't it, Connor? And I guess that will help as a starting point. And we'll come on to sort of a fuller look at the squad later in the pod, because we're going to discuss Stuart Webber's interview to start with. But that in itself probably means that you don't need quite as much of a big squad, whereas this season that has really benefited them, that they had options to turn to.
Yeah, and that's the fact that they're going back, as things stand anyway, to 3 substitutions rather than the 5 they've had available to them in the FL this season. So that would show that maybe they probably need a smaller squad altogether, because certainly if they carry more options, then there's going to be limited game time for quite a few of those. And you sort of speak about togetherness and stuff. If you've got players in the background training every week, knowing they haven't got a possibility of getting into the matchday squad, then that can affect the standard of others around them. So I think we will see probably a churn to the squad, and Norwich probably coming out of this summer with a smaller squad than what they have currently. I mean, it was quite Daniel Farke's always sort of, since he arrived at Norwich, spoken about how he prefers to work with kind of smaller squads. But this season we kind of saw the reverse of that because of the implications of COVID, because of all the stuff you spoke about there rightly, in terms of the scheduling, in terms of the grind, having that variation as well for Farke to change his options if need be. And next season, I think it is going to be probably, and again, Stuart Webber spoke about this yesterday, similar to what Burnley have done since they got promoted, where you have a real core group that you can rely upon to maybe help you establish yourself in the Premier League for 2-3 years. And I think there is probably a cycle now that they're working through in terms of we're seeing possibly the end. And again, we'll go sort of further to this later on, I guess, but probably the end of that first wave of Daniel Farke and Stuart Webber signings, Marco Stiepermann, Onel Hernandez, etc. And there is probably going to be a changing of the guard to an extent. We've seen that earlier this week, and we were with Teti and Vrancic as well. So I think there will be a smaller squad. I don't think they need, like you said, fewer games, bigger gap between fixtures as well. Free substitutes, all of those factors probably indicate that it's not going to be as big a squad as it's been this season. The key to it is going to be whether or not they can keep their players fit, because ultimately that will dictate whether carrying a small squad works for them or against them, I think. And if they can avoid the injuries and keep that continuity, something we know Daniel Farke likes a lot, then though that could be a real core of players that grow in the top flight. If we see what we saw 2 years ago and there's lots of injuries and suddenly we're seeing central midfielders playing in defence, then that becomes an issue, as we saw. So it is a bit of a risk, I suppose, in that regard, but you can certainly see their logic given all of the sort of circumstances that they're about to walk into.
Yeah, I'm probably not alone in this, but after Norwich's relegation, certainly the first few months, I didn't really pay any attention to the Premier League at all because it was so busy and so hectic. I was just totally focused on the Championship and Norwich. And I can't remember what game it was we were coming back from, Pad, but they were talking about that whoever was on the radio at the time had just made their third and final sub, weren't they? And I said to you, what? They've only got 3 subs in the Premier League. And I just double checked, and it is 3 from 9. I mean, that's a bit odd, but given that the Championship has been able to continue with 5. I can't remember what game that was.
Yeah, no, I do recall that anecdote. Yeah, so what's the matchday squad? Is it still 18 in the Premier League?
Yeah, so they still can name 9 subs. I just double checked that because off the top of my head, I presumed it was 7, but no, still 9 subs, but only 3 of them can come on, which is a bit odd. I wonder whether that will return to 7 subs for next season. I haven't seen anything on that yet, but
No, I'm not even thinking about certainly VAR. I'm going to need to clear out about a week in my diary to get to the bottom of that. Although they're supposedly tweaking it again, aren't they? So they'll probably make it even worse.
Yeah, there's a meeting planned, isn't it, of the Premier League clubs where they'll have the opportunity to give feedback and see where they want to tweak it. And I was reading a bit last night. We won't get too deep into VAR now because no one wants to just yet. But where the little lines that they draw on the replays, apparently that isn't done in other countries. And of course, when you do that, that tends to wind up TV pundits and fans watching from home and stuff. So I think there are a few quite easy, delicate tweaks they could make. But anyway, let's get on to the main issue of the pod, Stuart Webber, and we'll kick off with our first clip. We've got 3 lined up for you from Stuart's interview, but of course the full thing is already out there. This is on his future. He stresses that internally his contract being up in 2022 as it stands isn't a big deal. Appreciates that outside of the club it's going to feel like a bigger issue. But before we start discussing that fully, here's what Stuart had to say on the issue himself.
Certainly from my point of view, I've always been crystal clear with Delia and Michael that I'll never leave them in the lurch, and I wouldn't put the club at any risk. So if in 12 months time when my contract up I need to stay a bit longer to help the club, I'm open to doing that. At the same time, in 12 months, if the club want me to disappear, I'll disappear as well. I fully respect that.
Yeah, 12 months. It's a long time in football, isn't it? Now, Stuart's just opened the door ajar a little bit there, hasn't he, Connor? And I think we all had a little inkling that might be the case just because of everything that's happened, because of the pandemic mainly, that, when he made that initial statement, it was literally, if I'm remembering this correctly, a few days after the win over Manchester City that we were down there talking to him. And that was when he'd initially said that 2022, he intended to move on to a new challenge. But life has been very strange since then. So, yeah, just opening the door a little bit to maybe staying longer. But as he's always said, to be fair to them, he won't leave the club in the lurch.
No, he won't. And again, this is quite a delicate situation. And I guess the pandemic has probably changed the plans a little bit, because Norwich suddenly find themselves with a 30 million plus hole in their finances that they didn't envisage 2 years ago. So in many ways, although it's a different situation, it's kind of back to where it was when he inherited it. So there's probably a degree of mess that he still feels he needs to clean up in order to pass it on to the next person without, or maybe doing a duty of care in terms of passing it on to the next person rather. Maybe that's a better way of phrasing it. And I don't think what we'll see is him signing a fresh X-year deal. I think it will just be a continuation. It'll be kind of these rolling contracts that you see quite a lot in football, where maybe at some point there's a natural break clause if maybe they reach the destination that he's hoping, maybe a bit sooner. But look, it's great news, isn't it? I think for Norwich City, and particularly given the reaction we've seen, I think that those two have been so intrinsic to what's happened here in the last 4 years or so. And I mean, we were at Colney yesterday. The sort of the development there at that site is incredible compared to what it was like, well, even a couple of years ago, even before that Premier League season. And Paddy referenced the soccer bot going up. That's the latest, isn't it? So it does feel like there's still more work to do. And I guess the fear from Norwich fans, as was the case at Huddersfield, albeit in slightly different circumstances, that when Stuart departed, there was a regression in the club, and maybe they didn't expand on the project that they'd began to kind of develop. So it is a big change, maybe sort of enforced because of the pandemic and sort of the impact that's going to have on travel. I think he openly said in the video he still wants to work abroad, and Brexit, of course, might have an impact on that. So I think there are various factors into his thinking, and maybe just needs a little bit more time to sort of figure things out. And where better to do that than the club, where you get a lot of freedom to kind of work and execute your ideas kind of as you wish, and one that allows you to make mistakes as well, which is quite rare in football. But obviously the big challenge for him is going to be this summer. It's going to be recruitment. It's going to be building a side to help Norwich stay in the Premier League, and ultimately whether it's a success or a failure will be judged on probably his work in the next few months. And yeah, it's going to be, I think, really interesting to see what he decides to do come next year. But I didn't get the impression that he was a man that was planning on sort of packing his bags and jetting off next year. I got the impression that maybe he's going to stick around a bit longer than initially he had planned.
I think I'm right in saying Bielsa's in that situation at Leeds, isn't he, where he's been basically on a 1-year rolling contract. So if that's what it ends up moving towards, then so be it. But Pat, I think I'm right in getting the sense from Norwich fans that everyone appreciates now, as with Farke, as we'll come on to Daniel's contract situation shortly, that these guys are going to move on at some point. Everybody does in football, don't they? And they are probably headed further up the football pyramid with the work that they've done. But what did you make in terms of the messaging from Stuart in this one, in terms of basically how he's dealt with this issue? Because we've all been wondering if this will become a simmering issue throughout the season. But he's kind of taken it head on here a bit, hasn't he? And put out the flames maybe before they started spreading.
100%. Very, very. I thought it was a very, very astute move, that because you can guarantee if we hadn't had that touch point with him and him to be so public and mapping out how he sees it, then this would have exponentially just grown as we progressed into the summer, pre-season, the start of the season. And then can you imagine if we'd got to January, for example, and we were publicly at least still unclear about the futures of those two? It had just been a bonfire by that stage. So he doesn't really say anything without thinking about what he's saying, is my take, having interviewed him very often now. So he will have probably gone into that round of media yesterday knowing the contract question was coming. That was a fairly obvious one. And he answered it in a way which basically takes the heat out of it completely now. Daniel, as we'll get onto very shortly, that looks like that's going to get done before the actual season starts. So that will be, set in stone. And then Stuart has made it clear that, he's not looking for pastures new. Connor's touched on the desire to work abroad and now the restraints on doing that, whether that's the pandemic currently or maybe the Brexit situation in terms of UK nationals working abroad. That is a major pincer as to why I don't think he's going to be moving abroad in 12 months. And also, there was some very additional interesting stuff in that answer that he said, it's not necessarily football is his next challenge. He talked about the relentless nature of it, the elements of the job or the profession he doesn't enjoy. We know what an F1 nut he is. It wouldn't surprise me completely if that sort of transferable skills that he would bring to any sporting organisation would take him in a completely different direction. So, it's it's good to hear, but ultimately your point is proven, Dave, that if it isn't to be next summer, it will be at some point thereafter. And it's important that the building blocks are in place, whether it's Daniel's replacement or whether it's Stuart's replacement, because as has been proven, we've spent the first 20 minutes of this pod basically eulogising about the work those two have done on and off the park at all levels of the football club. And if they are to move on, whether at the same time or slightly independently of each other, if the club is to continue to progress within the self-sufficient model, then their replacements are massive appointments for the club, and they have to get those right. And Stuart, as he said yesterday, as he always says, the debt he feels towards Delia and Michael ensures that he will do everything in his power to find a replacement for him when the time comes that will continue on the work that he's put in place so far. And that holistic approach to what the club are doing is pervasive at every level of the business, whether it's developing young talent, whether it's the infrastructure, the mid to long term planning that bleeds into every decision they make, and that will continue to be the case with Webber and Farke. And I'm sure there's a lot of Norwich fans heard that news yesterday and immediately been quite reassured, because if we hadn't heard that at some point in the near future, then I'm pretty sure this summer would have been Daniel Farke getting touted with clubs left, right and centre. That might still happen, but at least now we know definitively that he wants to stay. And if everything is okay on the contract front, which I'm sure it would be, he will stay. So at a stroke, the fear that Farke won't be the man to lead him back to the Premier League is removed. And Webber, he's a man of his word. He says he's going to be here. And I don't think there's any doubt he will be here for the next 12 months and probably a little bit beyond now. So that certainty, that clarity is there now. And I'm sure, as I say, Norwich fans will be very glad to have heard those sound bites from the sporting director.
Well, let's bring Stuart back in, because I don't think we can really go too much further with this discussion without the Farke element, can we? Because they're so intrinsically tied together, as they have been throughout their whole spell at Norwich. So here is what Stuart had to say, or a little bit of what Stuart had to say about Daniel's potential new contract this summer.
He loves it here. He loves the club here, and obviously we love him, and it's a real mutual respect, which is sometimes quite rare in football. But I think it's genuine. I think he knows he's been backed very much so in difficult times, and we know he's backed us very much so in difficult times. And again, I'm sure in 10, 15 years or whatever, people will look back and go, he's probably, one of the greatest managers to ever manage his club, and huge respect for that. So we'd like to extend it. He'd like to extend it, and we'll have conversations now over the summer. I think what's been important for us all is, this season has been so hectic, as was the end of last season, was to just get it done, get this job done, and then almost think about other things in the summer. And now we've got some time to do that, and he's enjoying some well-earned downtime, and I'm sure we'll sort his contract out in due course.
So, of course, that was the news which really, as Pat said a minute ago, got Norwich fans quite pumped up on Thursday evening, because it's very, very welcome news as you head into the Premier League after promotion. But there's some really interesting elements, I think, to this, Connor. I mean, just to sort of play devil's advocate a little bit. For instance, Daniel signs the contract. We all know how difficult the job's going to be as a self-funded club. They are basically trying to defy the odds in surviving the Premier League, let alone becoming stable and successful at that level. So that's the first, the next stage of the journey almost. But if it doesn't work out, and that COVID hole means that they do go back down, or contributes at least to them going back down to the Championship, and they can't manage it, but Daniel has signed a new contract, what would that mean? We've seen he's been linked with Frankfurt and Wolfsburg in Germany already. He hasn't even signed the contract yet, but we know that he wants to be in the Premier League. We just heard it from the man that sort of matters. But there's a lot of really interesting elements to Farke committing his future to the club, isn't there?
There is, yeah. And I think what it shows for me is that he's keen to develop in terms of his body of work rather than perhaps individual seasons. He's keen to be seen, okay, he did this over X amount of seasons, rather than, okay, he got promoted at this season, relegated this season. I think there's a consistency that he wants in his work. He's spoken about the Jurgen Klopp and Mainz example before, hasn't he, about the fact that Klopp was relegated with them and yet still managed to get them back up and then eventually moved on to Dortmund. And it's kind of that progressive element in a job, I suppose, not just in terms of result by result, but year to year, and actually improving the club and bringing it up with you. And I think that's probably how he'll view whether or not he's successful at Norwich. And it is interesting, and what we've sort of spoken about in terms of Stuart Webber is interesting, because if Daniel Farke commits to 3 years and Stuart Webber's not looking beyond the next year and a half potentially, then there is going to be a period where perhaps Daniel Farke sort of outlives Stuart Webber at Norwich City. And what does that look like? And I think there are lots of interesting elements, and maybe there is part of it. Part of the reason Webber's decided to come out yesterday and sort of say that about his own future is to offer some reassurance to the head coach. I don't think that's sort of beyond the realm. So there's lots of really interesting elements to it. But I think if he's a Norwich manager, head coach for 6 or 7 years, and in the end that leads to Premier League stability or security, or he manages to keep them up, which is something that no manager has achieved in nearly a decade now, then that will be deemed as a success. He will be seen in terms of what he's done in terms of developing youth players, transforming players like Emi Buendia from £1.5 million into 30, potentially even £40 million players. I think that's how his work at Norwich City will be judged, as opposed to results on the pitch. So even if Norwich City did theoretically get relegated next season, I still think his stock would be quite high because of what he's done overall. And you could probably, again, if you're him and perhaps you're walking into a job interview, use those sort of circumstances, say that you were sort of kind of operating with your hands behind your back to an extent, use the examples of players that you've progressed, show how you've kind of pushed the youth into in the right direction compared to where it was before you arrived. So I think he strikes me as someone who wants continuity, wants consistency in his work, rather than kind of riding on the peaks and troughs of it. So that's kind of how I view it, and why I think this commitment is probably, in terms of helping Norwich push for the next 3 years, rather than perhaps sort of up and downs, if that makes sense. So I think he's looking at it as a 3-year kind of job, rather than maybe we need to desperately stay up in the Premier League this time around, otherwise I'm a failure. I don't think it's quite as crystal clear as that. And I use the example of, if you finish 17th in the Premier League, that's a success. If you finish 18th, that's a failure. That's quite a big kind of difference. I think that isn't really a way to judge success for me. So even if Norwich did go down, I still think his stock would be fairly high because of what he's achieved, if that makes sense. So I don't think in terms of results on the pitch, it'll have a massive bearing in terms of what he decides to do, be it next year or be it 2 years down the line.
Yeah, now it should go without saying that, of course, we don't want that to happen. From our point of view, we want Norwich to go and live the fairy tale next year. We want to go and win the Premier League title and do a Leicester. That makes our jobs brilliant, doesn't it? So I'm just playing devil's advocate here, really, Pad, and trying to sort of really look at the other side of the coin on it. But the way that Webber and Farke have spoken, it's not often that people get to ride off into the sunset and leave a football club on a high, is it? I think, say, Alex Ferguson managed to time it quite well when he left Man United, didn't he? I suppose Paul Lambert would probably say that he left Norwich at a good point, with them 12th in the league, although it was quite an acrimonious exit. We've just seen Alex Tete and Mario Vrancic sort of do it, but Tete was always signed up as a squad player for the season, wasn't he? And Vrancic didn't really play a great deal in the second half of the season. So those two, they set their stall out quite early on this, didn't they? That they hope that they do have ambitions. Everyone has ambitions within the game, and they would like to leave the club in a better state than they found it. But that isn't an easy thing to actually achieve and to time it correctly. So if things didn't go well next year, do you think that there could be something like sort of relegation clauses in a Farke contract, something along those lines?
Oh, there'll definitely be break clauses. There's no two ways about it. Not so much maybe for the relegation promotion element, but Stuart's situation. I could see, because they are almost joined at the hip, and that in itself is rare to have that, certainly in English football, almost unique, I would suggest, to have that type of relationship, where, Stuart said himself, they're very different people, but yet in terms of working relationship, it just works. They know their spheres of influence, and they complement each other perfectly. So, and ultimately, let's not forget that Daniel Farke is at this club because he was Stuart Webber's hand-picked choice to be the head coach, to embark on this brave new world. So I would think Daniel would want some reassurance around Stuart's future, and not as Connor rightly says, in terms of I'm here for X amount of years, but just possibly if Stuart at some undefined point beyond 22 decided he had to go or it was time to go, that Daniel would have an opportunity then to review his situation. I think that's probably going to be set in stone into that contract that Daniel signs. And that's understandable because, as we've discussed here in this segment, ultimately, Daniel Farke at Norwich City, all he's ever known is Stuart Webber. And in terms of, that crucial support pillar that he needs to go and do his job and the trust that he feels he has to go and do the job the way he wants to do it, if that's removed when Stuart Webber goes, even if it was to be an internal candidate who he might actually know, it's still not Stuart Webber. So that's got to inject quite a degree of certainty into a head coach's mindset, I would think. So, yeah, I think there's no two ways about it that ultimately their paths are pretty intertwined, and I think that will continue moving forward, and that will have a bigger bearing on the situation with those two guys than it does in terms of what Norwich do or don't do in the Premier League, I think.
Yeah, and they will move on eventually. Everyone does. That's football. So we've got to be ready for it, and we've got to be realistic about it. But hopefully they can get things right. Beyond, this is just another interesting element of it all, though, Connor. Maybe I'm looking at it with yellow and green glasses a bit too much, but I don't think there's many clubs in the country at the moment where there's quite such an interesting story, such an interesting project. I think you could probably look at Brentford as the closest other example of a club who are trying to sort of do things the right way without spending loads of money that they don't have. Barnsley to an extent, although I think they do have a bit of money behind them, don't they? The Moneyball characters and stuff who were brought in a few years ago. So, Brentford do have a bit of money behind them as well, don't they, with Matthew Benham, but are trying to sort of do things the right way. But this element with Farke and Webber, it makes what we're about to cover this summer and then next season just incredibly intriguing at every turn.
Yeah, and strip it all back, and I think there's a really interesting concept that is probably alien to 95% of English football, which is at face value, results don't really matter. It's about the processes and the performances, and if you get those right, then the results will inevitably follow. And that's kind of the mantra that they've had over the last few years, and that's an incredibly brave statement, I think, to make in a competitive environment, when ultimately you're playing people, and to a lot of people the results do matter, and they are it does sort of dictate people's moods for the weekend or whatever. So to strip that back and to try and say, okay, if the result is the end goal, how do we get there consistently, rather than maybe just hoping to put a team out of the pitch and win on a consistent basis? How do we make that a bit more sustainable? And that's a really interesting concept. And I think when you look at it like that, that's probably what makes this Norwich idea probably slightly different to the vast majority of clubs who don't have that outlook, and they just strive to win no matter what. It doesn't matter how you do it or what team you put out or who you play even. You just need to get 3 points. And the fact that Daniel Farke, we spoke about kind of his job security, and it is a good point, because if Norwich lose their opening 7 games next season, we know there's going to be no speculation in terms of his future. Whereas I bet the other 19 clubs that won't be the case, and it's because of the kind of structure they have in place and belief they have in that. And I think the fact that could have got tested probably last summer and didn't was probably a testament to how strong they believe in it. That really was the test, and that's what makes this interesting, because now it's about, okay, they've proven that they've cracked it at the Championship level. Can they now go and do it a step higher? Have they, people will say, learnt the lessons, but can they do maybe what they did 2 years ago better on a bigger scale with more resource or whatever? I think that's what's going to make the summer and next season so interesting, is this sort of tweaked Daniel Farke system that we've seen this year in terms of a bit more pragmatic, a bit more defensive resolve. Is that transferable in the Premier League? Does that result in Premier League survival? So there's lots of questions, and in many ways, I think if you're an observer of Norwich City, not even a fan particularly, but even if you're watching the Norwich City project in the round, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people probably in the EFL watching Norwich City with interest, because if they can prove that it works, then that's when people will look at it and go, okay, maybe we need to move similar to something that Norwich City have done, in terms of you don't need to spend vast amounts of money. You can promote from within. You can sign players relatively cheap and flip almost their value on its head. So it's a really interesting year for me, because I think if, as you said, Dave, playing devil's advocate, if they do go down, then I think there will be a lot of reflections in terms of whether this type of project and whether self-sustainable ownership can work in the Premier League or whether there's a ceiling to it. So there's probably a lot of philosophy about the season coming up. But as we said, ultimately, it will be dictated on whether they stay up or not, which is kind of a contrast to what we said about results. So it's going to be really fascinating in terms of, how they approach the transfer market and how they try to rectify what they learned 2 years ago. But then equally, the results that they get in the Premier League and whether we see a drastic kind of sea change from what we saw 2 years ago. And if so, how that works. So, yeah, I think sitting here, 6 weeks before the start of pre-season, I'm pretty excited to see how it all unfolds, I must be honest.
But think about the love that they got from the national media for, being the worst bottom team ever in the Premier League. If they actually play that kind of football and manage to stay up, the amount of praise that Webber and Farke and those players are going to get is going to be absolutely off the scale, because they are going to be bucking the trend. And Stuart Webber did speak a little bit about looking at the way Burnley did things, but of course we know that it's a very different style of play. So, right, let's move our attentions onto transfers then and bring you our third and final clip from Stuart Webber for now, which is teeing up the transfer business, which might not be, it might be a bit of a slow start to the summer, but there's certainly going to be plenty happening.
We're going in with more resource this time. It's still more resource by our standards as opposed to by other standards. So are we going to be signing a £30 million striker? Definitely not. But will we spend more money? Yes. Will we potentially need to generate some more as well? Well, yeah, that might be that we sell one of our, let's say, more in demand players to help fund even a bigger sort of transfer spend. But that's about being open and honest and realistic about that, because we'd only sell one of them if it was right for us. We wouldn't not going to sell one just to build up a transfer fund, because maybe the better value is in keeping these players, right? But the fact is we have to improve. We have to have players who can come and impact it on day one, and that doesn't necessarily mean a group of 28-year-olds, but certainly it's got to be players who we think can improve our starting 11 and give Daniel some really nice problems.
So a fairly familiar story, Pad. Norwich fans will be pretty used to this kind of story. Even if Norwich were to spend 50-60 million this summer, which, short of selling all the crown jewels, they're not going to, they would still probably be spending less than every one of their Premier League rivals. So as we were just talking about before that clip, Norwich are doing things differently here, aren't they? So what's your read on Stuart, how Stuart's teed everything up?
It's no longer crown jewels now, Dave. It's in-demand players. That's the new buzz phrase for the summer. And we all know that both phrases refer to the same three players, Aarons, Buendia, Cantwell. I mean, you could say that's the first public admission from essentially the figurehead that one or more will depart this summer. But I think we've all probably felt one or more would depart this summer anyway, just because of the natural evolution of, as Stuart said again yesterday, the journeys of these players. Max Aarons, possibly, if he'd have pushed it harder, could have gone last summer, but stayed on the ship. As a club, they decided Barcelona and a loan inquiry with no obligation wasn't for them. But there is no doubt him of the three, for me, will be in demand to a tangible extent, not endless speculation with no, as Stuart said yesterday, the phone getting picked up to him. But he looks, for me, like a man who's probably going to go on and get himself a very decent move this summer. And that will probably be the one that Stuart's referring to there, that will then allow them to be a bit more ambitious in terms of the type of player, the values they can afford this summer. Because if that doesn't happen, I think the implication in that little segment was that they're going to have to be a bit more circumspect, not to the degree they were 2 seasons ago, where they were really up against it financially. And it was the summer of Amadou on loan and Patrick Roberts and Ralph Farman, I think it showed in that set of accounts, total obligations in terms of loan fees and salaries amounted to about 6 million for the business they did that summer. It'll be well north of that, even if they don't sell any of those three players. But the reality is they're now balancing plates. They're dealing with, as we've discussed, 30 million plus COVID hole now. There's still no clarity around supporters in terms of a full house arriving back at Carrow Road in August. That has to be factored in as well, because the situation stands that Norwich is one of Norwich's main revenue drivers outside of the TV money. Probably the main driver outside the TV money is what they get through the gate from a 27,000 home crowd, 25,000 home fans, 22,000 of those season ticket holders. So if there's no clarity at this stage of the summer about when they can allow a full house back at Carrow Road, that allied to the hole they've already got to fill in terms of the pandemic and the financial aspect of it, dictates clearly, and Stuart's mapped it out there, very clear, black and white, everybody can see it, that they will have to sell one or more of those three players if they want to do the type of business they need to do, or that they want to do, should I say. So, but that said, we didn't quite hear it in that clip, but Stuart made it quite clear that they will only be going for club record deals. If any club wants to pick up the phone and talk anything less than that, even in a pandemic-infected market, in terms of the money that might be available, that isn't going to happen. So I think I would take that to be still like Ben Godfrey, like James Maddison, albeit Maddison was a necessity in terms of the finances at that stage. Ben Godfrey's a better example. Ben Godfrey only went because it suited Norwich. As much as it suited Ben Godfrey, maybe it only suited Norwich in terms of the financial package that Everton could put down, and take that mantra and apply it to any of those three players this summer. If it doesn't make sense financially for Norwich, it won't happen. But for me, that's the clearest signal yet that, one or more of those will leave. And of course, that then prompts more questions about Norwich's viability to stay in the division, because if you're losing an Aarons, a Buendia, a Cantwell, by definition, Daniel's squad is weaker than it would be if you kept them. So it's a balancing act, but ultimately, at the heart of all of this, they're a self-sufficient club. They can only continue to do what they're doing if they can generate funds. And one of those avenues, alas, will continue to be, as long as these two are at the helm, selling their best assets when the time is right, when it suits all parties. And it clearly looks like this summer, in one or two of those cases, that's where we're going to get to, that position.
Yeah, and that, of course, can't be forgotten that they've already committed to about 15 million to bring in Gibson and Younulis. You're talking about a Greek international, and Gibson, when he was fit, was in England squads, wasn't he? So they are, I think there's pretty much universal agreement, good investments, and they were good signings. Stuart and the recruitment team now, they've proved that they can do the Championship. They nailed it really last summer, didn't they? Now it's where they've got to prove that they can set up a Premier League squad, but that's not going to be easy with the resources they've got to play with. But let's stay on the in-demand trio, triumvirate, whatever you want to call them, Connor. I think with Max, most people have kind of come to they've dealt with that, haven't they? That he's probably, at the age he is and the amount he's achieved already in 3 seasons, he's ready to go and take a big step up. So I think most people have already dealt with that. And as Pad's just teed up there, if they can make that, they would have to replace him, I think, as we'll come on to a bit later. But that will give them just a little bit more wriggle room to spend with. But Cantwell and Buendia, there's 2 interesting dynamics to both of them, I think. Obviously, Cantwell's contract situation, having 2 years left on his deal, so his value will start depreciating unless he has one heck of a season in the Premier League and, scores 10, 15 goals or something. And with Buendia, there's the impact of COVID, as Pad's mentioned as well. And is anyone going to be able to spend a 40 million-ish fee on someone like Emi Buendia, who undoubtedly way too good for the Championship, but didn't totally convince in the Premier League?
Yeah, I think there's 2. My feeling on Buendia is split, to be honest. I think part of me thinks, looking at his data this year, the metrics, the highlights, the headlines that he's got, one team is going to push themselves out, I think, and probably make the risk to sign him, because I think he's at this stage now where he's probably too good for a club not to commit to. Equally, if you're a top club in England, let's say Manchester United theoretically, and you're looking to sign someone from a newly promoted Championship team, in terms of messaging, that's really tough. In many ways, you're better to sign someone who hasn't been playing at Real Madrid than someone who's been playing very well at Norwich, just because of, in terms of, I guess it depends on how your club kind of does things, but in terms of commercial stuff, and obviously we know Manchester United in particular are big on that, then that's kind of the way you edge it. But if any recruitment team in the Premier League has their head screwed on, really, you would imagine that they're aware of Emi Buendia and his talent. Equally, if I'm probably a Premier League recruitment team and Norwich are asking, let's say, in excess of £30 million for him, then you're going to want to see probably another top flight season in a better team to see if he can do it again. I mean, let's not forget, although his creative numbers were very good in the Premier League, he scored 1 goal. So that is kind of a mark against him. I think we have seen an improvement in his temperament, and so I think he's a difficult one to judge. My feeling is, honestly, I think one team will take a gamble on him, and I think he'll go on to obviously be the fantastic player that everyone here knows he is. And if that happens, then there'll probably be other teams looking around and probably asking themselves why they didn't make that decision sooner. But yeah, I think as Stuart said, these clubs are owned by billionaires. If they want to pay the fees, they will find them. I think pandemic or no pandemic. Todd is slightly different. I think although his goal scoring was very good in the Premier League, there wasn't the same in terms of creative numbers that Buendia had. I kind of said last year that if you merged the two together, then you'd have had an ideal Premier League player, I think, in terms of sort of goal returns and creative numbers. Equally, he's really kicked on since Christmas in terms of his game. He's a better athlete now, I think, compared to 2 years ago. And I think there's a real desire there. So Norwich are probably in a position this summer with Todd where it's you either cash in now or you renew his contract. I think that's kind of the trade-off. So because like you said, Dave, as soon as you don't do that, you kind of the asset gets devalued to an extent. So it's a really difficult, interesting situation. Obviously, he's got a year left with an option, hasn't he? So we'd expect that to get triggered, I think, irrespective, unless he signs a new deal. And again, with him, my problem is where does Todd go if he leaves Norwich? Because I think he is a player that fits in with a certain style of play that wants to play football. Leeds is probably, for me, an obvious one in terms of a team that would maybe attract him in terms of the type of player he is. Part of me wonders whether he'd be better suited going abroad after Norwich, because I think it's going to be very difficult to find a team outside of the top six that maybe are capable of playing the style of football that he needs. So I think there's lots of dynamics into it. But if you ask me here and now, with the whole summer ahead, I would probably expect Todd Cantwell to be a Norwich City player come the start of the season. And Emi Buendia, I'd say, is probably really in the balance.
I think I'm probably with you on Todd. And I think that's an interesting shout about going abroad. I think when you look at what Jadon Sancho's done over there, I could see Todd fitting into the Bundesliga and doing really well and maybe kicking on and really flourishing. But that's an interesting side of things. With Buendia, I think La Liga is one that we can't overlook. You know, Atletico Madrid, I think they have been linked, and you could see him fitting in there. I'd love to see him go and play for Pep at Man City if he was to be leaving, because I think Pep would really just finish him off and make him such a top player. But I just don't think Man City will need him, will they? They've got so many good players. I think you probably, again, Bielsa, I mean, he plays similar style to Guardiola, doesn't he? So you could see Buendia really, really flourishing under him if Leeds wanted to splash out a bit of money. But that's if somebody's going to make it, I think it might be a bit of a surprise one with Emi and maybe a Villa or a Leeds or an Arsenal, and he's got to go to that level because those clubs do have money. But yeah, what's your sort of take on just briefly on that, Pad, before we start working our way through the squad?
Yeah, I wouldn't add too much more. I think basically we've dissected all three and where they are in their careers and what type of interest there might be. And I think we get to a point where Aarons is the most of and ready of the three, to move on for the fees that they could command. And yeah, we've discussed it. Stuart said quite rightly that there might be some elements of the transfer market that reflect the pandemic and the financial hit, but he feels at the elite end, you will still see the big clubs willing to commit to the big fees. And if that is the case, then look back at last summer, look at the clubs he was linked to. As we know with these things, not all of those emerged into tangible interest. In fact, it was only Barcelona who really put the phone call into Stuart Webber. But the scale of club that man is being linked with, he's now 12 months further down the line. He's played for England's under-21s at the Euros, didn't go well for the team, but you know that's the level of player he's in and around now in terms of England representation. He's got another championship title, another promotion, and I think he will be no longer a Norwich player by the end of the summer ultimately. But it is really interesting, and ultimately, if they lose Max Aarons and it allowed them financially to keep Buendia and Cantwell, I think if that's the equation, I think most Norwich fans would take that, wouldn't they? Because obviously those two, if they can, for reasons you boys have just discussed, continue to show that creative productivity, not just potential in the Premier League on a consistent basis, then Norwich's chances of staying up and bucking the odds are increased dramatically, I would suggest, because that's the problem. You could say they had the problem at one end of the pitch and the other, but I think ultimately they didn't score enough goals or create enough in the second part of that Premier League season. If they could do that this time around, they're in with a fighting chance. So I think ultimately all roads lead to a Max Aarons exit, but hopefully, I'd concur with you boys, those two still in the building come the opening day of the Premier League season.
We shall see. It's going to be very interesting. Right, we're going to close out the pod. Just going to go through position by position, really. We'll skip over the keepers, really, because that's quite straightforward. We all know Tim Krul's the number one. He signed a new contract at Christmas. Stuart said yesterday that Ørjan Nyland, they're in talks. But as we all know, he's 30 now. He was a Norway international. If someone comes in for him and offers him a number one shirt, then you'd have thought there might be a chance he can move on. But realistically, we're talking about competition and cover for Tim Krul there, aren't we? Michael McGovern's already signed his new deal. Daniel Barden, if he goes out on loan, you've got Archie Mayer. Aston Oxborough often gets forgotten about because he's had such a nasty injury. You presume he would have a loan, but they've got quite a few young, talented keepers on the books. So you've got your fourth choice there, whichever one it may be, John McCracken, Joe Rose, Sam Blair. They've got a lot of keepers on the books, haven't they? So let's go with right back. Well, let's go full back first then, Connor, shall we say. On the right, you've got Max Aarons, Barley Mumba, Sam Byram, who it sounds like they're hopeful that he's going to be back in the mix in pre-season, but we'll see. And on the left, obviously, your Nulis as you start again, Byram in contention, and maybe Sam McCallum. So what's your read on the fullback situation? And do you think that is an area they need to bring someone in for?
If they sell Aarons, definitely in terms of right back, I think the big one for me, it'll probably all hinges on Sam Byram, because if, as you said there, that he's back, kind of available for selection at the start of pre-season, has a good pre-season campaign, then we know from 2 years ago, I mean, he kept Jamal Lewis out of the side at left back for a spell, didn't he? And was very good actually in some of the games that we saw before he kind of limped off against Liverpool. And he was at Colney yesterday, wasn't he, when we were there sort of doing individual work. So hopefully that's a good sign. And if they can get him sort of up to scratch and fit and keep him fit, which I guess is maybe the biggest issue, then they've got a very good player there. And that probably would mean they don't really need to do anything extra, because as we've said, he can play left back, he can play right back, he would provide cover there. I think if Aarons did go, they'd probably need a frontline right back option that they could kind of, I don't want to say rely on, because that's probably a bit harsh, but you get what I mean. Maybe a more consistent, maybe more quality option there. Yanulis offers that on the left. Mumba is probably just a little bit off it at the minute, but in terms of long term, he's the guy, isn't he? I think, and we've seen glimpses of that this season. So for me, it hinges on Max Aarons staying and Sam Byram being fit. If both of those things happen, then I don't think they need any extras in the fullback areas, to be honest. And then Sam McCallum, I can see getting another loan to the Championship, and I don't think he'll be short of offers. Pad's maybe better qualified to speak about his performances at Coventry, but it sounds like he's done pretty well by all accounts. So I'm sure he'll have plenty of suitors at that level. Hopefully, maybe to a side, Pad, with genuine promotion ambitions. Maybe that's the next step for him. So yeah, I think that's probably how I see the fullback areas, to be honest.
Yeah, that's an interesting example of how Webber always has to have in mind that he is planning for the worst, doesn't he? The club financially and in football terms. So just take that as an example. If Byram recovers fitness, McCallum goes out and plays at the top end of the Championship. Which hopefully, of course, they won't, Norwich come back down, you've then got a ready-made player to go into that Championship squad, haven't you? So that's just sort of one example of how it all works. But yeah, interesting. My one thought with Byram is, even if he is recovered, even if he has a full pre-season, I still don't think you can just expect that he will be available all season. I still think there's got to be another man ready to step in case things don't work for him. But of course, every single Norwich City fan agrees that, or hopes that Sam Byram is back next season. Let's move on to centre-back, Pad. So we've got Hanley, Gibson, Zimmerman, Omar Bamadeli, who I think we're all expecting to be part of it. And then Sorensen can do a job there. Fanawo and Bashiri have had sort of mixed loan spells away from the club, haven't we? So do you think I suppose from what we've heard from Stuart yesterday, that one centre-back is looking pretty likely to be on the shopping list, isn't it?
Definitely on the shopping list, yeah, no two ways about it. And we're talking about cover and leaving themselves short, and it was graphically illustrated 2 seasons ago. this part of the cycle. And okay, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but no Zimmerman, no Closer. Grant Hanley then got injured early part of that season, and you left basically putting square pegs in round holes. Essentially, I'll never forget, Bournemouth away, and it's Alex Tete and Ibrahim Amadou at centre back in the Premier League. Is it any wonder? And Stuart did reference that yesterday. If they get to that scenario again, they will go down again, because you will get found out in the Premier League if you have to do mend and make do essentially for a prolonged period of time. Maybe you get away with it for 1 game or 2 games, but so for those scarring experiences alone, they won't want to leave themselves short. Bamidele clearly now is seen as the shining light of that young batch of centre backs you talked about. I think without giving too much away, I think we can probably assume that Bashiri and Famewa won't be part of the Premier League or possibly part of Norwich his longer term future. And as a result, if Bamidele is your 4th sort of centre back in the mix, then you probably do need to bring another one in, because ultimately, Zimmerman, Gibson, Hanley, 2 of those I think we would all expect to be the frontline options. But if injury and then suspension intervenes, then you don't really want to be exposing Bamidele for a prolonged period in the Premier League. So, yeah, there's no doubt about it. They've been linked with a lot of centre-backs already, particularly the lad at Celtic. I doubt it'll be him, but they will be looking to make an addition in that area. And obviously we've forgotten Tim Closer, who is still technically under contract, but by all accounts would want to continue at Basel, although he's had a very mixed season there on loan, I think. But there is a buy option there. But certainly put a line through him. He's not in the equation moving forward. So ultimately, with a fair wind, there will be a senior frontline centre-back joining that party over the summer.
Yeah, I just think after the injury crisis of 2019-20, they cannot at any point allow themselves to be in that situation. And knowing football, they'll probably get themselves all prepared for it. And then Gibson and Hanley will be absolutely fine all season. They won't need it. And they'll assign someone for a load of money who doesn't get the games. Or, that would be very, very typical of football, wouldn't it? But Close is a good example. Sort of the vibe we get, those players who are out of contention at the moment, your Lightners, Dermot's, Tribals, it seems like those doors are closed and that they're unlikely to come back into things. So I think we can probably forget them in terms of this conversation. So attacking midfield, then Connor, and then we'll finish with strikers for Pad. This is one because we've already teed it up, really, haven't we, with Cantwell and Buendia, that bit of uncertainty about whether they will still be here or not, or certainly there's a chance. But if you've got Buendia, Cantwell, Kieran Dowell, Stiepermann, Puerta, Hernandez, Josh Martin, there's quite a few bodies there already for them to, try and work that into the options that they need.
Yeah, and as we sit here, only one that I would be absolutely certain that is going to be in the Premier League with them next season, which is probably Kieran Dowell. So yeah. It's a really interesting area of the pitch, and I wrote about this PinkUn.com earlier it was yesterday, wasn't it? And I think in terms of obviously Buendia and Cantwell, we've spoken about in terms of their situations, and then of course there's the others. Marco Stiepermann, who's had a very difficult year in terms of his health and injuries, and obviously in the back of everyone's mind will be perhaps that failure to step up 2 years ago and show that he was at the level consistently anyway. Hernandez probably the same, lots of injuries and whatnot, but both are really good characters around the group. So I don't think you'd be terribly upset if they're both in the building come kick off on August the 4th or whenever it is, because everyone knows the type of lads they are. They're not going to sort of be throwing toys out of the pram or whatever. Josh Martin, I think he's at a stage where he probably needs a loan, doesn't he, to go and get some consistent football. And then Placetta's a really interesting one because he's not really, I would argue, fit in with what Daniel Farke wants to do. I think he still looks incredibly raw. So my inkling is they'd probably be open on both fronts if there was a loan offer or an opportunity to maybe break it there. So yeah, at this stage I'd only say a real certainty that Kieran Dowell is going to be in the building, but realistically there'll be 2 or 3 others as well, plus any additions they make, and obviously I think that they'll probably look maybe to get a winger that can probably do a job as a striker as well if absolutely need be. So that's kind of how I see it playing out. But yeah, I think there's the potential for a lot of change, particularly in this area of the pitch because of the options, and it kind of links in what I said earlier in terms of the cycle, and Steepman and Hernandez maybe being at the end of their sort of respective Norwich City journeys and whatnot. But yeah, we shall see. This is the area where players cost money as well, isn't it? So that's worth bearing in mind. It's going to be incredibly difficult in terms of their price range to maybe recruit options, as we mentioned earlier, that are possibly better than what they have. But that's the task of the recruitment team, isn't it?
Yeah, Josh Martin's a very talented player as well. So similar to what I said about McCallum earlier, and as we teed up, with only being able to make 3 subs in games, that game time probably isn't going to be there for him. So he's going to be better served by playing football. And he's someone, again, who hopefully not, but maybe even if Norwich stayed up, if he'd gone away and had a good loan season, he could then come back in, because we all can see he's got the ability and the talent. So that'd be interesting. Poeta and Hernandez, for me, just seems like you keep one of. And for me, I keep O'Neill, because he's capable of more than we saw this season. And Poeta, similarly, if you sent him on loan to, say, Belgium or Holland or somewhere like that, he could go and do well. Or maybe the German second division, he could go and get back to that sort of form that he was showing in Poland. So, yeah, I'd be keeping O'Neill of the two of them. And Kieran Dowell, I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago saying that I think that there's definitely a Premier League player there. And the thing that sticks in my mind is how well he played coming in off the right when Buendia was unavailable at Forest that night, because his wife his partner had given birth the night before, and he looked good. So he could be a potential Buendia replacement. I think Kieran Dowell could have a pretty major role to play for Norwich next season, so we shall see. And to bring it to a close, the forwards, Pad, Pukki, Ida, Jordan Hugill, and then the youngsters at the moment of Soto and Omatoy, who are probably looking at loans again. How do you see that going? I've already gone on the record of saying I think they need another one, but do you think there will be another one?
It doesn't seem that way. I mean, Connor touched on it there, where he said a winger who can play striker, and that seems to be where the headspace is at the minute. Now, that will surprise a good few, because we've just talked about the defensive parallels and trying to avoid the mistakes, essentially, of not having enough stocks in that area 2 seasons ago. Well, that to me was what happened in the central forward areas. You know, there was so much reliance on Pukki, and wasn't he excellent in the opening months of the season? Premier League Player of the Year that very first month, first player since Efan Okoku for Norwich to score a top flight hat trick. But he was never the same player again after he damaged his foot at Leicester in December of that season, and as a result, Norwich were never the same again as an attacking force. Dermich was a gamble that failed spectacularly. He will not be part of the way ahead, that is for sure. And it seems that they are still going to be reliant heavily on Pukki, and obviously he's going into the Euros potentially with a big question mark over his fitness, and that would be a concern for me. That even if he gets through that tournament in terms of fitness, there's so many miles on the clock. He's literally not stopped now for 2 or 3 years, and that has to catch up with a player at some point when you get past 30. So I wouldn't say it's a gamble, but it's certainly rolling the dice on a high stakes, call. If you're not now looking for an out and out striker, I mean, the feeling is maybe because of the substitutions we've talked about liberally that you don't. What is the point? Given Daniel is such a fan of Teemu Pukki and he's going to be the frontline striker and he only plays one up top in terms of established forward, what is the point in spending a lot of money when they don't have a lot of money to spend? Because as Connor rightly says, top-end players, they go for the biggest money, and strikers particularly, strikers who have proven and can score goals in the Premier League, you're talking telephone numbers, and Norwich simply don't have that amount of finance. So I can see the economics of it, why it makes sense, but ultimately, Teemu Pukki, heaven forbid, gets himself injured in the first few weeks. Then what? It looks like at the moment, Adam Ida is the one they're pinning a lot of hopes on. They really feel, and we saw a glimpse of it on the final day, of a season which for him personally was very down more than up. Injuries and periods out of the team, rehabbing, and then coronavirus diagnosis as well. But they really feel he potentially could emerge as the one to take some of the pressure off Teemu. It doesn't seem at this stage, and we've talked about Hernandez and Poeta and that ilk of player. I think you can probably file Jordan Hugill in that area of where they're thinking this summer. If there was potential offers and it made sense, you're thinking maybe championship level, then I think there could be a deal to be done there. And again, that isn't 100% a reflection on him and his inability to maybe step up into the Premier League. It might also be the finances in play, that they obviously get a transfer fee, they can reinvest those wages as well, and to allow them to bring in maybe options who they feel are better suited to the Premier League. So, on the face of it, if you are willing to let Jordan Hugill go, you're not willing to bring in another striker, and you're really willing to put a lot of eggs in the Teemu Pukki basket with Adam Idah in reserve, then I think there might be a few Norwich fans who are a little bit concerned about that. But ultimately, Webber and Farke trying to do something with finite resources, and maybe they look at other areas of the squad and they feel that needs more attention, particularly the central midfield. We didn't really touch on that in this little segment, but ultimately they really need to focus on that area now, because if Ollie Skip isn't coming back, Alex Tete won't be coming back, and you have Kenny McLean and Lucas Rupp currently injured, and the experience of 2 seasons ago where that was an area of the pitch they were sadly lacking in terms of the physical requirements. That's clearly the priority this summer, ultimately, is central midfield. So if that's the priority and you only have a limited amount of resource available, probably you're going to have to take a little element of gamble in the forward areas. But there's no doubt about it, there would be unease, I think, in many quarters if they go into the new season with essentially Pukki and Idah.
Right. Well, I hope that was all fascinating for everyone in the way we've laid it out there. I just thought that would be helpful to actually go through the squad, because it just gives an indication of Stuart Webber. Basically, if you grew up playing Championship Manager or Football Manager, that is his job, isn't it? He sits there all day and does it in real life, and we've just touched on it all there. Really, it's the tip of the iceberg, and that's why we'll be able to keep the pod going throughout this summer. I'm sure that we won't be short of things to talk about. There will be various elements of this shifting all the time through until I think the transfer window closes for the Premier League purchases at the end of August. And then I think there's talk of there being another domestic window, isn't there, for a couple of weeks in September. So they could still do business with Championship clubs, but it would mean Premier League clubs wouldn't be able to buy anymore. But we'll come on to all that in the summer. I think that'll do for this week. Thank you very much, boys, for your thoughts. I hope that gave a little bit more insight into the really interesting interviews that Stuart Webber gave on Thursday. And we'll keep bringing you all the main lines from that. Of course, PinkUn.com, EDP and Evening News. I did want to mention as well, it was in Thursday's papers. There we go. It was a 32-page supplement reviewing the season. You can get hold of them on our website if you missed it as well. But I think we've just about managed it. It's tomorrow as well, isn't it, Connor? Saturday is the People's PinkUn.
That's right. Sorry, just get myself unmuted. Yeah, that's right. I have to double check quickly how many pages it is. 16-pager. People's PinkUn. So basically one that we've allowed the supporters to fill with their pictures and their words of what's been a remarkable season. Obviously, they've been absent. So it's a nice thing to do. And it's been nice to kind of look through all the pictures and read all the messages. So hopefully people enjoy that.
I actually ventured out and got a paper yesterday, which we don't actually get to see the physical paper too much these days, unless we make the effort, do we? But I persuaded myself to go and get some fish and chips and pick up a paper while I was there. Do keep an eye on everything that's going on. There's loads coming your way, and as we've mentioned a couple of times, that documentary, The Way Back, the PinkUn YouTube channel, and the poem read by Stephen Fry, To Those We've Missed. Make sure you have a look at them if you haven't already. But for now, thanks very much for listening to the pod. We come to you in association with Future Radio 107.8 FM, and we'll catch up with you very soon.